The certified envelope sat beside Helen Mercer's coffee for almost 20 minutes before she opened it. At 72, Helen knew what certified mail meant better than most people. She had spent 31 years behind a clerk's counter watching envelopes like that change marriages, estates, homes, and futures. Still, she nearly dropped this one into the recycling because the return address meant nothing to her. The letter came from a small law office in western North Carolina, 2 counties beyond anywhere she had reason to go. The attorney's name was Calvin Reese. The client named in the first paragraph was Silas Boone, her late father's cousin. Helen had met Silas 4 times in her life, maybe 5 if she counted a family picnic she barely remembered. He had died 3 weeks earlier at 79. He had left her a cabin, a little over 3 acres, and every interest attached to the land. Helen read that sentence twice. Then she reached the paragraph that made her set the paper down. Silas had given Calvin one specific instruction about Helen. Do not contact her until the divorce is final. The land had technically appeared in Helen's divorce papers as a remote family interest she would receive after Silas's death. Frank's attorney had called it a rural remainder with almost no present value. Frank had not challenged it. He had fought over retirement money, business asset, and household property, but on that point he had simply nodded. At the time, Helen had mistaken his silence for exhaustion. Now the letter said Silas had kept a separate file concerning the property and had ordered that it remain private until Helen was legally free of Frank. Helen looked at her coffee. It had gone cold again. Her 1-bedroom apartment west of downtown Asheville was quiet enough to hear the heat cycle on and off. The place was clean, comfortable, and smaller than any home she had lived in since her 20s. She did not think of it as empty anymore. She thought of it as edited. On the refrigerator was one photograph of her daughter, Molly, standing with her husband and 2 teenagers on a windy overlook outside Seattle. Helen had bought the magnet, holding it up during a courthouse retirement trip she had taken years earlier. She sometimes measured the distance between North Carolina and Washington in miles. Other mornings she measured it in the length of the pause before Molly said, "I'm fine." Helen had been awake since 5:30. Retirement had not cured her of getting up early. 3 decades at a courthouse taught a person that showing up was not a mood. It was a habit. She picked up the letter again and read the attorney's final sentence. There are additional materials Mr. Boone intended you to review in person before making any decision about the property. Helen folded the letter along its original crease. For the first time in 2 years, the divorce felt unfinished, in a way that had nothing to do with Frank. The question was not what Silas had left her. The question was why a nearly silent man she barely knew had spent years making sure Frank could not reach it first. Helen had met Frank Mercer in 1989 at the courthouse service window. He was 38, broad-shouldered, sunburned at the neck, and irritated with himself rather than with the clerk who rejected his permit application. He had forgotten one supporting form. He came back the next morning with the form and discovered he had missed a signature. On the 3rd visit, he arrived carrying 3 coffees in a cardboard tray. "I figured I've taken up enough of everybody's morning," he said. Helen had been 39 and already tired of men who believed charm could replace consideration. Frank was not especially charming. He was prepared, patient, and embarrassed when he made other people work harder than necessary. At that stage of Helen's life, she considered those qualities far more impressive. They married 14 months later in a church with fewer than 50 guests. Helen's father sat on the front pew. Frank's mother cried before the music started and denied it afterward. Their daughter Molly was born 2 years later. The 3 of them built a life in a modest house on the west side of Asheville. Helen planted tomatoes and green beans in a sloped backyard every summer. One year she tried cantaloupes and spent 3 months pretending the failure was educational. Frank built her raised beds without being asked. He remembered the dark green paint she had mentioned once while washing dishes. That was the part Helen found hardest to explain after the marriage ended. Frank had not spent 30 years being cruel. He had spent 30 years being complicated in ways she had not known how to see. There were seasons when they were close, and seasons when they functioned more like competent roommates. They paid bills, helped Molly with school, attended funerals, replaced appliances, and grew older in the same house. Helen believed familiarity was a kind of knowledge. For a long time it was enough. In 2015, Frank formed Mercer Property Holdings, an LLC, for his contracting business and rental investments. He explained it over dinner with a folder open beside his plate. He talked about liability, taxes, and separating business risk from personal assets. Helen listened with half her attention because the explanation sounded ordinary. Just paperwork, Frank said. Nothing that changes our life. She signed where he indicated. She had signed documents beside him for 25 years. Until then, none had given her a reason to ask whose interests the paper protected. She did not know Frank opened a separate business account 2 counties away. She did not know he bought 3 rental houses through related LLCs between 2016 and 2019. She did not know he had begun building financial walls long before he ever spoke the word divorce. Frank did not think of those walls as theft. That did not make them harmless. His father had lost nearly everything twice when Frank was a boy. The first loss came from a small business partnership based on trust and no written agreement. The second came from a loan to a friend who disappeared before repaying it. Frank grew up watching a decent man work harder every year and end up with less. Somewhere in adolescence, he made the kind of promise frightened boys make to themselves. Nobody would ever be able to take what he built. By middle age, that promise had become a system. Frank saved copies of deeds, formed companies, moved ownership, and learned to see every shared asset as a future vulnerability. Once, around 2018, Helen found him alone at the kitchen table staring at an old photograph on his laptop. It was the small brick house his father had lost when Frank was a teenager. When Helen asked what he was doing, Frank closed the screen. Nothing, just work. She accepted the answer. Years later, Helen would remember that photograph and understand more than she wanted to. Fear explained Frank's behavior better than greed alone ever could. It did not excuse what he did with that fear. Frank filed for divorce in the spring of 2021. He sat across from Helen at their kitchen table and told her he wanted the rest of his life to look different. His voice was controlled enough to sound rehearsed. Helen listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked whether there was someone else. Frank said no. The marriage, he said, had simply run out. Helen hired Denise Harper, a family law attorney with 2 decades of experience and no patience for vague financial statements. Within months, Denise saw signs that Frank's business structure deserved a deeper look. She explained what that would take. A forensic accountant would have to trace transfers, related companies, purchase dates, and the difference between what Frank controlled and what he personally owned. The likely cost was $10,000 to $12,000 for any contested hearing. Helen had the money. That was what made the choice so difficult. The money sat in the retirement account that was supposed to carry her through the next 20 years. She could spend a large piece of it, proving she might deserve a larger piece of something else. Or she could stop. By the second year of the case, Helen was paying rent, legal fees, and the ordinary cost of starting over at 70. She opened her retirement statement and did the arithmetic herself. Then she called Denise. "I'm ready to settle." The agreement divided retirement funds, personal property, and what could be identified without further accounting. It also acknowledged a future family interest tied to a small mountain parcel held by Silas Boone for life. Frank's lawyer described it as remote, rural, and functionally illiquid. Because it was expected to remain Helen's separate family property, Frank did not ask for any claim against it. He did not ask what rights ran with it either. Helen noticed that only in hindsight. At the time, she was grateful to have one line in a settlement that did not require another argument. She signed because the cost of continuing had become more frightening than the possibility that she was missing something. People talked about divorce later in life as loneliness, paperwork, and learning to sleep in a different room. Helen learned there was another part people mentioned less often. A system did not have to be designed to punish you for money to decide how long you could afford to search for the truth. She had spent 31 years reading public records for other people. She had never imagined she would be the one who stopped reading because the next page cost too much. The morning after Silas's letter arrived, Helen called Calvin Reese. He answered on the second ring. His voice had the unhurried rhythm of someone who had lived in the mountains long enough to distrust urgency unless there was smoke. Helen introduced herself. "I've been expecting you," he said. She offered condolences about Silas, though the words felt formal for a man she had barely known. Calvin did not seem offended by the distance. He was a good man, he said, quiet but never careless. Calvin explained the basic arrangement. Years earlier, Silas had recorded a deed that kept him in possession for life and left Helen the remainder interest. It had been enough to appear in a title search during her divorce, but not enough to tell anyone why Silas had chosen her. When he died, full title moved to Helen. The cabin was modest but sound. The well worked. The roof had been replaced within the past several years. Taxes were current. There was a recorded water use instrument tied to the parcel that Calvin wanted another attorney to explain in detail. Then his tone changed slightly. Silas asked me to tell you one more thing. Helen reached for a pen. He wanted you to see the place yourself before you sold, leased, transferred, or signed anything. Did he tell you why? Calvin was quiet for a beat. No. But I handled his legal work for almost 30 years, and I never saw him prepare for something without a reason. Helen wrote the directions on a yellow pad. She underlined the words, "See it yourself." 2 days later, a real estate agent called her. Her name was Marla Denny. Marla had a warm, practiced voice and introduced herself as a broker who specialized in rural mountain property. She said she had noticed the change in ownership through public records. That part was entirely possible. County deeds were public, and brokers watched filings for potential listings all the time. Marla said Helen might be surprised by how quickly land with creek frontage could move. "I'd hate for you to make a decision before you understand what you're holding," Marla said. Helen almost smiled at the wording. It was good advice. It was also exactly the kind of sentence a person used when she wanted to be invited into the decision. Helen asked how long Marla had worked the area. She asked what kinds of buyers were active. She asked whether Marla already had a specific client in mind. Marla answered smoothly without giving Helen anything she could call false. After they hung up, Helen wrote the date and time beside Marla's name. The deed had changed less than 2 weeks earlier. Helen herself had known about it for only 4 days. 31 years in a courthouse had taught her that speed was a fact. Sometimes a fact meant nothing. Sometimes it was the first thing that meant everything. Marla had not merely noticed the transfer. Helen suspected she had been waiting for it. Marla called again that afternoon and offered to drive Helen to the cabin. She could show her the property lines, introduce her to people nearby, and help her understand the market. Helen thanked her. "I'm going alone." There was a small pause at the other end. "Of course," Marla said. "Call if you change your mind." Helen tore the page with Marla's number from the pad, folded it, and put it in the kitchen drawer. She did not throw it away. Retired court clerks were capable of leaving a room untidy. They were not naturally gifted at destroying a paper trail. The following morning, Helen left Asheville before sunrise in her gray Honda Civic. She had bought the car 11 months earlier without asking Frank, Molly, or anyone else which model made sense. That afternoon at the dealership had been the first time in decades she realized how satisfying a completely private decision could feel. The trunk held a small bag, a thermos, a jacket, and enough clothes for 2 nights. Helen had written Calvin's directions on paper, even though they were also in her phone. The roads narrowed as she drove southwest into the mountains. October mist hung between ridges. Cattle stood in wet fields with the calm indifference of animals that had seen better scenery than tourists ever would. At a roadside stand, pumpkins sat beneath a hand-painted honor-box sign. The bright fall color was patchy, not postcard perfect. Helen liked it better that way. Her phone lost service after the last small town. She checked the screen once and set it on the passenger seat. For the first time in years, nobody could reach her. The realization felt less frightening than it should have. For almost an hour, there were no notifications, no missed calls, no little red numbers waiting to be cleared. There was only road, wet leaves, and mountain ridges folding into one another. At 8:47, the phone buzzed once. A weak signal had appeared just long enough for a text to arrive from an unknown number. Helen read it at the next safe pullout. "That land has a complicated history. Talk to someone before you go farther." There was no name and no second message. Helen looked at the timestamp. Whoever sent it knew enough to guess she was already on the road. She wrote 8:47 on the back of her directions. Then she kept driving. Calvin Reese's office stood in a 1-story brick building in the fictional county seat of Alder Glen. The wooden sign over the door had weathered almost back to bare grain. Calvin was waiting outside when Helen pulled in. He was shorter than she expected and dressed in an old field jacket over a button-down shirt. He shook her hand once firmly. "I'll lead you up," he said. Calvin drove a dark red pickup with a long crack across the windshield. Helen followed him north, then off the paved road, then onto gravel. At the final turn, he stopped and came back to her window. "Your phone will try to put you across the creek," he said. "Don't listen to it." Helen nodded. He had known Silas most of his adult life. On the drive in, he told her what that friendship looked like from the outside. Silas bought the acreage in the early 70s and never borrowed against it. He repaired almost everything himself until age made some jobs foolish. When he hired people, he paid what they asked if the price seemed fair. He wasn't stingy, Calvin said, he just hated waste. A little farther up the road, Calvin told her about a visitor Silas had received years earlier. A man from Asheville had driven up in a dark blue luxury sedan and asked about buying the land. The man was dressed for an office, not a mountain road. Silas had turned him around before he got out of the car. Helen kept her eyes on the gravel ahead. Did Silas tell you his name? No. Calvin glanced toward her. But I remembered the car. Helen said nothing. Frank had owned a dark blue Lexus for almost 10 years. It had carried a personalized plate built from the initials of his company. Calvin's truck rounded one more bend. Then Helen saw the creek. It ran narrow and quick over flat gray stones, clear enough for her to see darker shapes beneath the surface. River birches leaned toward it from both banks. Morning light broke through the branches in pieces. Helen lowered her window. The water sounded closer than it looked. For reasons she could not explain, the sound made her chest tighten. Calvin stopped beside a small clearing and pointed through the trees. The cabin sat on a slight rise above the creek. It was not impressive. It was simply solid. Weathered board siding had gone silver-brown with age. The metal roof showed two newer patches. A porch crossed the front of the house, and a wooden swing hung from chains at one end. Some of the porch railing was new enough to show pale wood where Silas had repaired it. Nothing about the cabin looked abandoned. It looked paused. Calvin handed Helen a ring with 2 old keys, though the front door was not locked. Silas stopped locking it years ago, he said. Why? He said a lock wasn't much use against the wrong person, and the right person shouldn't need one. Helen looked at the cabin. That sounds like Silas. Calvin smiled once. Unfortunately, he gave her his number again and drove back toward the county road. Helen stood alone in the clearing until the pickup disappeared through the trees. Then she walked onto the porch. The front door opened with a quiet scrape. Inside was one main room, a compact kitchen, and a small bedroom at the back. A cast-iron stove sat near the interior wall. A propane refrigerator hummed softly. Wide pine floorboards carried the scratches of decades without looking neglected. An oak table stood beside the window. 2 chairs were pushed under it. On the table sat a filled kerosene lamp and a folded piece of paper. Her first name was printed across the front in block letters. Helen. She stopped just inside the door. The paper did not frighten her. It unsettled her in a more intimate way. Someone had expected her exact presence in this room. Helen did not touch it yet. She walked through the cabin the way she had once reviewed case files, starting with what was physically there. The stove had been cleaned. The ashpan was empty. The sink pump produced cold, clear water after a few strokes. The refrigerator was empty but working. In the bedroom, an iron-frame bed held a neatly folded wool blanket. A pair of reading glasses rested on the nightstand beside a stopped wind-up clock. A narrow shelf held old paperbacks and a field guide to southern Appalachian trees. The guide's spine was broken from use. Outside the back door, a small porch faced the creek. A woodshed under a lean-to roof held enough split firewood for more than one winter. Beyond it, a garden occupied a patch beside the cabin. The season was over, but the beds had been cleared and turned. The rows were straight. Helen stood at the kitchen window looking at them. Silas had known he was dying. He had prepared the garden anyway. The act felt less like optimism than discipline. Do the work that belongs to the season, even if somebody else will see what grows. Helen returned to the main room. The folded paper still waited on the table. She had been inside almost half an hour. She had run out of respectable reasons not to open it. The note contained one sentence. 3rd kitchen board from the stove, press the right corner. There was no greeting, explanation, or sign-off. Helen laughed under her breath for the first time that day. Silas Boone apparently believed preambles were another form of waste. She went back to the kitchen and counted floorboards. On the 3rd board, she pressed the right corner with her palm. The wood shifted. Helen pressed harder. One end rose just enough for her fingertips to catch underneath. Beneath the floor was a dry cavity lined with old canvas. In the center sat a bundle wrapped in waxed cloth and tied with a leather cord. Helen lifted it out. It was heavier than it looked. She carried it to the table and untied the cord. Inside were 3 main things. The first was an envelope with Helen's name and a date from September 2001. She stared at the date before opening it. In 2001, Molly had been 9. Helen had still packed school lunches before sunrise and spent weekdays moving court files from one room to another. Frank had been building houses and talking about expanding his crew. Nothing in Helen's memory of that year contained Silas Boone. She unfolded the letter. Silas wrote that he had watched Frank at Helen's father's funeral 3 years earlier. Frank had spoken to him several times that day. Each conversation, Silas wrote, had somehow returned to the same subjects. The cabin, the acreage, the creek. Silas had not accused Frank of anything. He had simply noticed. A man who inventories another man's property at a funeral is gathering information for some reason, Silas wrote. I hoped the reason was harmless. I decided not to assume it was. Silas wrote that he might be wrong about Frank. He hoped he was. But if he was not, he wanted Helen to have a place Frank could not quietly turn into one more business asset. The letter ended with Silas's initials. Helen read it again. 21 years earlier, while she had been living what she thought was an ordinary marriage, Silas had begun paying attention on her behalf. She had never asked him to. She was not even sure he liked her enough to do it. Apparently liking had not been the point. The second item was a pocket notebook bound in dark leather. The corners had gone soft from years of handling. Helen opened to the first page. The entries were dated and spare. They were not confessions or speculation. They were observations. June 2003, Frank Mercer called asking whether Silas would sell the acreage in creek frontage. Silas wrote that he said no. 3 weeks later, Frank called again. Silas did not return the call. April 2008, Frank drove to the cabin in a dark blue Lexus and offered to buy the entire parcel. Silas told him the land was not for sale. Frank left without getting out of the car. March 2012, a neighboring landowner told Silas that Mercer Property Holdings had begun buying tracts nearby through related companies. Helen turned another page. The handwriting remained small and even. Silas had recorded events the way a farmer recorded rainfall. No speech, just dates, names, and what happened next. January 2015, state filing located for Mercer Property Holdings at Frank's Asheville business address. Helen stopped reading. She knew the address. She had sat in Frank's office at that address and signed business papers without asking what else had been filed there. She remembered driving home afterward and making dinner. The memory was ordinary enough to hurt. Helen turned to the later pages. By 2019, a private water company called Clear Spring Resource Partners had contacted Silas about a long-term commercial withdrawal arrangement tied to the creek. The company's preliminary figure was $340,000 over the term being discussed, subject to legal review and negotiation. Silas did not accept. Instead, he printed the inquiry and put it with the property records. His notebook said Frank had learned about the company's interest through local contacts. One entry ended with a sentence longer than most of Sis's notes. Frank has wanted the land for years. The cabin is not the reason. Helen closed the notebook halfway and looked toward the creek. Then she opened it again. The final pages concerned title records, an old water use instrument, and the name of a surveyor who had worked in the county for decades. Silas had known there might be questions about the wording. He had also known exactly who could explain them. The third item in the bundle was a manila envelope. Inside were copies of the recorded deed, the life estate arrangement, maps, tax records, and an older recorded agreement concerning water use from the creek. Helen read the documents slowly. She knew enough from courthouse work to recognize when she did not know enough. The papers appeared to give the parcel a valuable contractual position, but she would not pretend she understood the limits. Clipped behind them was the printed 2019 email from Clear Spring. At the bottom of the stack was a white index card. Silas had written 6 short lines. This is why Frank wanted it. Not the cap, not the timber, the water. Get an independent lawyer. Not anyone Frank sends you. Helen sat down on the kitchen floor with the documents in her lap. She did not remember deciding to leave the chair. The creek continued outside, quick and indifferent. She thought about Frank's lawyer calling the property interest practically worthless. She thought about Frank declining to ask even one follow-up question. She thought about Marla Denny calling 4 days after Helen learned she owned the land outright. Then she thought about the anonymous text. That land has a complicated history. During the divorce, $10,000 had been enough to make Helen stop digging. Under Silas's kitchen floor, a different set of records had been waiting for her to start again. Helen repacked the documents and carried them to the car before the afternoon light disappeared behind the ridge. She drove until her phone found 2 bars of service. Then she pulled onto a gravel shoulder and called Molly. It was after 4 in North Carolina and early afternoon outside Seattle. Molly answered on the 3rd ring. "Mom, everything okay?" There was a keyboard clicking in the background. Helen pictured her daughter at work, headset nearby, calendar open, half a dozen obligations arranged in careful blocks. "Everything's fine," Helen said. It was not true, but it was close enough to continue. She told Molly about Silas's death, the cabin, and the package under the kitchen floor. She described the notebook, the old water company inquiry, and Frank's repeated attempts to buy the land. Helen told the story in order. That was how she had learned to speak when details mattered. Molly listened without interrupting. When Helen finished, her daughter asked about the old dollar figure. 340 was from 2019. Yes. Then don't treat it like a current value. Get an independent appraisal. Helen smiled despite herself. That was my thought. And you need a lawyer who actually handles land and water agreements, not just whoever did the estate. Calvin already said the same thing. Another pause. Have you eaten? Helen looked at the empty granola bar wrapper on the passenger seat. I've had enough. That isn't what I asked. Helen laughed once. The sound loosened something in her chest. Then Molly's voice softened. Do you want me to come out? The offer was real. Helen could hear that. She could also hear Molly's mind turning toward flights, work meetings, school schedules, and her family's calendar. No, honey, I'm all right. You sure? I'm sure. Helen surprised herself by meaning it. They stayed on the phone a few more minutes. Molly told her to call as soon as she knew more. Helen promised she would. Their goodbyes had become careful after the divorce. Neither woman had done anything unforgivable. They had simply learned to approach each other as if one wrong sentence might open a conversation too large for the moment. Helen ended the call and watched a pickup pass on the mountain road. The driver lifted 2 fingers from the steering wheel in greeting. Helen raised her hand back automatically. Molly had given her smart advice. What Helen needed from her daughter, however, was not expertise. At 72, Helen was old enough to know those were different needs. She dialed Calvin Reese. I need the name of the lawyer you trust, she said. The Cedar Ridge County Register of Deeds opened at 9 the next morning. Helen arrived 15 minutes early. A clerk named Nora unlocked the front door and found Helen waiting on the steps with a notebook under her arm. You know we're not open yet, right? Nora asked. Old habit. Nora looked at her for half a second and smiled. What are you after? Helen asked for parcel transfers around the creek corridor near Silas's land from 2012 forward. She also asked for entity names connected to Mercer Property Holdings. Nora pulled what was available from the public system and printed the maps Helen requested. Helen spread 11 parcel records across a counter. She started with dates, then owners, then mailing addresses. 8 of the 11 nearby tracts were owned by Mercer Property Holdings or by LLCs tied to the same registered business address. On the map, they formed an uneven horseshoe around Silas's parcel, not a complete ring, close enough to make the pattern impossible to dismiss. Helen borrowed a yellow highlighter from Nora. She marked each Mercer-related tract. When she finished, Silas's 3 acres sat in the center like the only uncolored piece in a puzzle Frank had been assembling for years. Helen stared at it without speaking. He had not been trying to buy a cabin. He had been trying to control a corridor. Calvin had arranged a meeting that afternoon with Tessa Cole, an attorney in her 50s who handled rural title disputes, land use agreements, and resource contracts. Tessa worked from a second-floor office above a family hardware store in Alder Glen. Her conference table was covered with closed files when Helen arrived. Tessa moved the stacks to the floor without apologizing. Calvin says you have old paper, she said. I have enough old paper to make you unhappy. That's usually the useful kind. Helen handed her Silas's envelope. Tessa read without talking. She examined the deed first, then the old water use agreement, then the later maps and Clearspring correspondence. When she reached the recorded instrument from the 70s, she slowed down. She read one clause twice. Then she leaned back. The right is real, she said. Helen waited. But the old description is messy. How messy? Not fatal. Expensive if somebody wants to fight about it. Tessa explained that the document used an outdated description of the permitted volume and measurement point. It had been recorded properly, and it followed the parcel, but the language left room for an opponent to argue about scope. They might not win, Tessa said. They might not need to. Helen understood immediately. They just have to make a buyer nervous. Exact. Helen folded her hands on the table. 2 years earlier she had settled a divorce because uncertainty had become too expensive. She had no interest in selling uncertainty cheaply a second time. Can it be clarified? Yes, we need a current survey, a certification of the creek boundary and withdrawal point, and a corrective recording that ties the old language to modern measurements. Tessa tapped the document. I'd also want to know whether Silas already discussed this with anyone. Helen thought of the final pages in the notebook. He did. Back at the cabin, Helen searched through Silas's papers again. She found nothing new in the floor compartment. The next morning, while looking for a dish towel, she opened a narrow drawer beside the kitchen sink. An index card had been pushed flat against the back. Silas's handwriting covered one side. Old water paper. Call Luke Avery and Alder to serve it years ago. He knows the fix. Helen held the card and stared at it. Silas had known exactly where the weakness was. He had also known enough not to waste half a page explaining something a professional could explain better. Helen called Tessa from the kitchen. Apparently Silas left us a name. Luke Avery was retired from full-time surveying but still kept his license active for occasional boundary work. He remembered Silas before Helen finished the first sentence. Stubborn man, Luke said. Calvin used careful. That's lawyer language for stubborn. Luke agreed to meet them at the property. He had participated in a survey there decades earlier as a young field technician. The old water use description, he said, had bothered him even then. Nobody cared much about commercial withdrawal in those days, he said. They cared where the fence was. Now people cared. Luke spent 2 days on the property with a modern survey crew. Helen watched from the porch when she was not making coffee or carrying documents between Luke and Tessa. They measured the bank, the access point, and the tract boundaries. They compared old monuments with current coordinates. Luke never hurried. Neither had Silas. By the end of the second day, he said the ambiguity could be corrected cleanly if Tessa prepared the filing. Helen felt relief. She did not mistake it for victory. A solvable problem was still a problem until the solution was recorded. That afternoon, a white SUV appeared on the gravel track. Helen was on the back porch with tea when she heard tires over stone. Marla Denny stepped out wearing ankle boots too clean for the road. I was nearby, Marla called. Helen set her cup on the porch rail. Were you? Marla smiled as if the question were friendly. I thought I'd see whether you'd had time to think about your options. I've been thinking. Marla glanced toward the creek before she looked back at Helen. The buyer I mentioned is serious. They have a financing window that closes in 2 weeks. I see. They're buying through an LLC, so it would be a very clean transaction. Helen had spent years watching witnesses become uncomfortable when silence lasted longer than expected. She let it laugh. Marla filled the space. If you want, I can bring you a written number before the weekend. I appreciate the drive, Helen said. I'm not signing anything. The smile on Marla's face tightened by less than an inch. Of course, just don't wait so long that the opportunity disappears. Helen watched the white SUV vanish in the trees. Then she took out her notebook. Marla came in person. Knew I was staying at cabin. His LL. 2-week financing deadline. Helen added one more line. Who told her where to find me? She closed the notebook and set it beside Silas' index card. For the first time, the difference between Silas and Frank felt almost painfully clear. Both men had spent years thinking ahead. One had used preparation to control what other people could reach. The other had used it to leave Helen more choices after he was gone. 4 days later, Tessa called Helen in Asheville. Helen was at the same kitchen table where the certified letter had arrived. This time, she made a point of drinking her coffee while it was still hot. I found something, Tessa said. Helen put the mug down. Tessa had been checking recent filings connected to Crike access, priority claims, and proposed water contracts in Cedar Ridge County. A new filing had appeared 3 weeks earlier. It asserted an interest in any future commercial water agreement involving the small watershed where Silas's parcel sat. The claimant was a company called Harbor Ash Holdings. The registered organizer was Janice Mercer. Helen did not speak for several seconds. Then she said, Frank's wife. Yes. Does Janice know what she signed? Tessa paused. That may be the most important question. Janice ran a small bookkeeping practice in South Carolina. Her business phone number was public. Helen found it in less than 5 minutes and then spent 2 days deciding whether to use it. She was not afraid of Janice. She was afraid of entering another woman's marriage with information she herself would have wanted earlier. On the second afternoon, Helen called. Janice answered on the second ring. Janice Mercer. This is Helen Mercer. Silent. Then Janice exhaled. I wondered if you'd call. Helen sat straighter. So you know who I am. I know you were Frank's first wife. Janice's voice was steady in a way Helen recognized. It was the steadiness of someone who had been practicing not to sound frightened. I've been trying to figure out how to contact you for about 6 weeks, Janice said. Why didn't you? Because I didn't know whether talking to me would help you or damage whatever you were doing. Helen looked at Tessa's notes on the table. Then maybe we should talk somewhere neither of us owns. They met 2 days later at a coffee shop in West Asheville. Janice was 52, compact, neatly dressed, with gray beginning at both temples. She stood when Helen approached the corner table. She offered her hand. Helen shook it. Janice did not apologize for marrying Frank. Helen appreciated that more than she expected. They ordered coffee and ignored the food menu. I knew he had been married, Janice began. Helen waited. He told me the divorce was straightforward, his word. Janice's mouth tightened. He said you both wanted out and the property issues were finished. They were finished on paper, Helen said. Janice nodded. That's what I'm starting to understand. She opened a folder on the table. Inside were bank statements, transfer records, and formation documents for Harbor Ash Holdings. Janice's signature appeared on the last page. Frank asked me to sign this 4 months ago, she said. He told me it was for a small real estate investment. Janice looked down at the paper. I'm a bookkeeper. I should have read every line. Helen did not say the obvious thing. She had spent a career around legal documents and had still signed what Frank put in front of her. Competence did not prevent trust from becoming a blind spot. Janice pushed the statements closer. I've been reading everything since then. The transfers were small enough to look routine by themselves. Together, they traced money through a cluster of business accounts and related entities. Janice had found Mercer Property Holdings 3 months earlier. Then she found several properties Frank controlled without owning in his personal name. 6 weeks earlier, she found Marla Denny. Helen looked up. Where? At a business dinner, Frank introduced her as a regional property contact. Janice had thought little of it until she began checking the companies tied to Harbor Ash. Then she searched public licensing and transaction records related to Marla's brokerage activity. Marla had signed a buyer representation agreement with an unnamed LLC client months before she ever contacted Helen. The property description matched Silas's parcel. Helen sat back. The coffee shop noise continued around them. A milk steamer hissed behind the counter. Someone laughed near the front door. At the corner table, the shape of Frank's plan became clearer without either woman raising her voice. What do you need from me? Helen asked. Janice looked directly at her. My attorney needs records from before my marriage. For what? To build a complete timeline of how Frank moved money and property across both marriages. Janice's fingers rested on the folder. If the pattern started before me, it matters. If he used marital money to build structures neither spouse could see, it matters to both cases. Helen did not answer immediately. Janice had signed something she did not understand. So had Helen. Janice had begun following transfers in silence because she no longer trusted the explanation attached to them. So finally had Helen. I have records starting in 2001, Helen said. Janice blinked. How? A man you never met kept a notebook. How long? 21 years. Janice stared at her. For the first time that afternoon, her careful composure cracked. 21. Helen nodded. The notebook is cleaner than most business files I've seen. Janice leaned back and looked toward the window. When she returned her eyes to Helen, the expression was not triumph. It was relief mixed with the knowledge that relief had arrived much too late to be painless. I think I've been looking for you, Janice said. Helen picked up her coffee. I think Silas was waiting for both of us to start looking. 3 weeks later, Helen drove back to the cabin with food for several days and Tessa's latest report in her bag. The independent valuation had come back. Clear Springs Consultants estimated the long-term commercial water agreement at roughly $410,000 in present negotiated value, depending on structure and volume. The number was larger than Silas's old inquiry by about $70,000. Helen wrote it down but did not celebrate. Numbers had become too slippery in her life to trust before she understood the contract underneath them. The air at the cabin was colder now. Wood smoke drifted from somewhere beyond the ridge. Wet leaves covered the ground around the porch. Helen carried in groceries and built a fire in the stove. The first attempt smoked. The second died. On the third, she followed the half-page of instructions Silas had tucked inside the tree guide. The kindling caught. The stove began to draw. Helen sat at the oak table with a cup of tea and watched the fire settle behind the little glass window. For nearly an hour, she did nothing useful. That was still a new skill. She slept in Silas's iron-frame bed with the bedroom window open 2 inches. The creak was loud enough to hear in the dark. It was not steady noise. The sound changed depending on which part of it she noticed. Water struck stone, broke, rejoined, and moved on. Helen fell asleep before 9. The creak was the first sound she heard in the morning. She carried coffee to the front porch and finally sat in the swing. She had avoided it on every previous visit. Using Silas's stove and bed had felt practical. Sitting in his porch swing had felt personal. The chains creaked once, then settled into a small arc. Helen looked toward the ridge through bare branches. Silas had probably sat there for thousands of mornings. He had watched weather move in. He had watched Frank's Lexus appear on the road. He had written down dates, repaired rail, stacked wood, and waited without turning his attention into obsession. That distinction mattered to Helen. Silas had not spent 21 years trying to punish Frank. He had spent them making sure Helen would have facts when facts became necessary. I hope I was worth the paperwork, Helen said to the empty porch. The creek answered in the only way it could. Helen finished her coffee and called Tessa. Clear Spring's first formal proposal was simple. The company offered to buy the commercial water interest outright for $410,000. One payment, no future revenue share, no continuing role for Helen. She said no. Tessa did not argue. 2 days later, Clear Spring returned with a dramatically lower offer. Its attorneys had found the ambiguity in the old recorded language. They claimed the uncertainty reduced the value of a full buyout to $90,000. The offer would expire in 14 days. Tessa delivered the news without decoration. Helen sat at Silas's table with the phone against her ear. $90,000 was still more money than she had earned in many working years. 2 years earlier, that fact alone might have ended the conversation. Now Helen looked at Luke Avery's certification on the table. The corrective survey had been completed. Tessa had filed the clarifying documents the previous week. Tell them to pull the county record again, Helen said. There was a beat of silence. Tessa's voice changed. You want them to know we fixed it? They already know enough to use the old problem against me. They can know the problem is no longer sitting there. Good. Helen looked toward the kitchen floor. Silas left me the name of the person who knew how to fix it. I'm just following instructions. The negotiation took 2 more rounds. Helen rejected an outright sale. She did not want Frank, Clear Spring, or anybody else turning a permanent right into a one-time check that separated her from the land. Tessa negotiated a long-term lease instead. Clear Spring would pay an annual base amount and an additional percentage tied to actual commercial use. Helen retained title to the property. The agreement set defined operating conditions and gave Helen termination rights if specific obligations were violated. The money was enough to cover Helen's ordinary living expenses without forcing her to draw down retirement savings at the same rate. For the first time since the divorce, she could put money aside instead of watching every month subtract from what remained. Helen signed on a Friday morning in Tessa's office. Before she signed, she read every page. Tessa waited. Nobody rushed her. At one clause, Helen asked a question Tessa had already answered the week before. Tessa answered it again. Helen signed only after the answer made sense a second time. When she finished, Tessa slid the executed copy across the table. You good? Helen rested her hand on the folder. I'm informed. Tessa smiled. That's better. Helen carried the agreement downstairs and stopped in the hardware store beneath the office. She bought a pack of waterproof labels and a black archival pen. Back in the car, she took Silas's worn field guide from the passenger seat. She wrote Silas Boone on one label and placed it inside the front cover. It was a small, unnecessary act. Helen liked it for exactly that reason. She drove back toward Asheville with the signed agreement in her bag and the windows cracked to the November air. She was not euphoric. The feeling was quieter. She had stopped being financially cornered. That was enough. The next Tuesday, Frank called. Helen recognized the number even though she had removed his name from her contacts months earlier. She considered letting it go to voicemail. Then she answered. Hello, Frank. His voice was the same measured voice she remembered from the divorce. Reasonable first. Emotion later, if at all. I heard you signed with Clear Spring. Helen looked at the steam rising from her coffee. That traveled fast. It affects property in that corridor. Yes. I think there's a way to handle this that could work for both of us. Helen did not ask what he meant. Frank continued anyway. He spoke about access, neighboring parcels, efficiencies, and how unnecessary conflict could reduce value for everyone. The language was businesslike enough to sound detached from the 21 years beneath it. Helen let him finish. Then she said, you had years to tell me why that land mattered. Frank was quiet. I was trying to protect what I built. I know. The answer seemed to surprise him. Helen continued before he could mistake understanding for permission. I know why you're afraid of losing things, Frank. I also know what you did with that fear. Helen, I'm not giving you control of this property. We can at least discuss. No, the word came out calmly. Helen had learned there were times when explanation created a door the other person could keep pushing open. This was not one of those times. You made your decisions before I knew I was part of them, she said. I'm making this one with full information. She ended the call. Then she picked up her coffee. It was still hot, Helen noticed. The week before, Tessa had filed a complaint with the State Real Estate Licensing Board concerning Marla Denny's conduct. The records showed Marla had a buyer-side agreement connected to the parcel before she approached Helen, as if she were only offering neutral help. The licensing process would take time. Helen did not know what sanction, if any, would result. She was satisfied that the documents were now with people whose job was to evaluate them. Helen gave Janice copies of Silas's notebook and the older company records Janice's attorney had asked for. What Janice did with them belonged to Janice. Helen provided copies and then stepped back. She had no desire to become the manager of another woman's divorce. Silas's gift had given Helen leverage. It had not appointed her anyone's rescuer. In December, Helen drove to the cabin for 4 days. On the second morning, she sat on the back porch with tea while mist lifted from the creek. Footsteps sounded along the side path. An older woman came around the corner carrying a mason jar covered with a square of cloth. She moved carefully but without hesitation. "You're Helen," the woman said. Helen stood. Irene Moss, I live over the ridge." Irene held up the jar. "Apple butter, Silas got one every winter." She placed it on the bottom porch step. Helen smiled. "That was kind of you. Habit more than kindness." Irene looked past Helen toward the kitchen door. "Silas told me somebody would take this place after him," Irene said. "He said whoever it was would be worth meeting, so I figured I'd come see for myself." "You keeping the place?" "Yes." The answer came before Helen considered it. Irene nodded as if that settled the only question she had come to ask. Helen listened until Irene's footsteps disappeared into the trees. Then the creek filled the space again. She carried the apple butter inside and put it on the shelf above the stove beside Silas's field guide. In January, Helen made an appointment with a small non-profit legal aid program serving older adults and low-income families in the Asheville area. She arrived with a folder, a budget, and 4 pages she had drafted at the cabin during December. The document was written in plain language. Its working title was "Before You Put Your Name on It." Helen had no intention of pretending it was legal advice. It was a list of questions she wished someone had forced her to ask when she still had money, time, and choices. Who owns the company that owns the property? What accounts or related businesses have not been traced? What does a forensic accountant actually do? And what would one cost before the case becomes urgent? Has an asset being offered in settlement been independently valued? What documents should you request before deciding that more investigation is too expensive? The program director, a woman named June Patterson, read all 4 pages before speaking. "Did you write this?" she asked. Helen nodded. "I knew most of these concepts from work. I just didn't know how badly I needed them in my own kitchen." June looked at the budget sheet. Helen proposed using part of her new lease income to fund a part-time consulting attorney and printing costs for the program. It would not pay anyone's full divorce bill. It would not solve the fact that detailed financial investigation could be expensive. It might, however, help someone recognize a red flag before the money was already gone. June tapped the first page. "This is useful because it tells people what to ask before they're embarrassed to admit they don't know." Helen thought about the documents she had signed beside Frank. Embarrassment is expensive too. The funding covered a part-time consulting attorney and the cost of printing plain language packets. It was not enough to make a difficult divorce inexpensive. It was enough to help another person recognize when a document, company structure, or unexplained valuation deserved a closer look. Helen did not need to turn herself into a cautionary exhibit to make the pages useful. She only wanted people to have better questions while they still had time to ask them. Spring reached the higher ridges slowly. In April, Helen drove to the cabin to reopen it after several cold weeks. A padded envelope sat on the porch step. The return address was Molly's home outside Seattle. There was no letter inside. Only 3 seed packets: tomato, green bean, a winter squash variety Helen had never grown. Molly had written the planting date on the back of each packet, nothing else. Helen stood on the porch with the seeds in one hand. The gesture was so practical that it almost undid her. Molly had not written a long apology. She had not tried to explain the distance between them. She had sent something meant to be planted in a garden they had discussed on Sunday calls. Helen put the packets in her jacket pocket. The next weekend she planted all 3 in the beds Silas had turned before he died. The tomatoes settled in quickly. The green beans did even better. The squash looked doubtful from the beginning. Helen planted it anyway. Molly called most Sundays now. The conversations were shorter than they had been immediately after the divorce. Helen considered that progress. Shorter meant they were less careful. They could talk about a teenager's school project, rain in the mountains, a recipe, or whether the squash was a lost cause. Some weeks they never mentioned Frank. Some weeks they never mentioned the divorce. The relationship was not repaired by one emotional conversation. It was being rebuilt by ordinary contact that neither woman had to prepare for. Helen had come to trust that pace. In May, she took the original folded note from Silas's table to a frame shop in Alder Glen. The paper contained only her name on the outside and the instruction that had sent her to the loose floorboard. The framer asked whether Helen wanted the writing visible on both sides. Helen thought about it. Just the name, she said. She chose a simple oak frame. Back at the cabin, Helen hung it beside the kitchen window where the first morning light reached the wall. Helen, printed in Silas's block handwriting, looked almost comically plain behind glass. That suited him. Silas had never left her a speech about courage. He had left a roof that did not leak. He had left firewood stacked dry. He had left a notebook with dates. He had left a professional's name beside a legal problem. He had left documents where moisture could not reach them. Most of all, he had left Helen the chance to discover information before someone else converted her ignorance into leverage. That was the part of the inheritance she valued most. The money mattered. It restored stability that the divorce had damaged. The land mattered. It gave Helen a place where her decisions did not have to be negotiated through another person's preferences. But information had changed the direction of her life before either money or land did. One warm morning, Helen carried coffee to the front porch and sat in the swing. The creek was hidden below the trees, but she could hear it. Molly's bean vines had begun climbing the simple string trellis Helen built beside Silas's old beds. Irene's empty apple butter jar waited by the door to be returned. The framed note caught a narrow stripe of sun through the kitchen window. Helen thought about Frank sometimes without anger arriving first. That did not mean forgiveness had erased consequence. She understood now that Frank's fear of losing what he built had been real. So had the damage he caused while trying to protect himself from that fear. Understanding both facts at once was harder than choosing a villain and easier than pretending nothing had happened. Helen no longer needed the simpler version. The creek had been running before Silas bought the land. It had been running while Frank made plans in Asheville and Helen stamped filings at a courthouse desk. It had kept moving while Silas wrote dates into a small leather notebook. It would keep moving after every one of them was gone. At first, that thought had made Helen feel small. Now it made her feel relieved. Not everything needed her control in order to remain dependable. She took another sip of coffee. It was still hot. She noticed that too. Trust is often described as the opposite of suspicion, but Helen's story points to a harder distinction. Trust and information are not enemies. A healthy relationship can survive questions about money, ownership, motives, and paperwork without treating those questions as betrayal. Frank's mistake began long before the divorce papers. He turned a childhood fear into a private financial system and then treated secrecy as if it were the same thing as safety. His fear was understandable. His choices still denied Helen the ability to make informed decisions about a life they had built together. Silas offered the opposite kind of protection. He did not decide Helen's future for her. He preserved records, protected the land, and waited until she could choose with better information. That difference matters because help can become control when it removes the other person's agency. Silas's help increased Helen's agency. The story also exposes an uncomfortable truth about expertise. Helen had worked around legal documents for most of her adult life, and Janice made her living keeping books. Neither woman was foolish. Both were vulnerable in the exact place where professional knowledge collided with personal trust. People often recognize warning signs more easily in a stranger's file than at their own kitchen table. That is one reason good systems matter. Independent review, clear questions, written records, and time to understand a decision are not signs that a relationship has failed. They are safeguards against the fact that love, fear, shame, and fatigue can narrow anyone's judgment. Helen's later work with legal aid did not promise to make expensive disputes cheap. It did something smaller and more realistic. It tried to help people notice when they needed better information before urgency took away their options. Her relationship with Molly changed in a similarly modest way. There was no single apology that repaired 2 years of distance. There were Sunday calls, seed packet, garden updates, and conversations that became less careful over time. Repair often looks unimpressive while it is happening. That does not make it weak. The most useful lesson in Helen's story may be that accountability and understanding can exist together without canceling each other out. She could understand Frank's fear without surrendering the boundary that fear had taught her to build. She could accept Silas's care without turning him into a saint or herself into someone who had been rescued. He gave her information and room. She still had to read, ask, refuse, sign, and live with the choices that followed. By the time Helen framed the paper with her name on it, the message had changed. It was no longer proof that someone had been watching over her. It was a reminder that being seen is most valuable when it helps a person see clearly for herself.